Hello, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the readings for section 4.2, which is pages 199 through 207, I think. Yeah, 207 of the textbook. And there's a little bit, there's a few pieces of terminology, vocabulary that we need to get under our belts first. And they're actually, those pieces of vocabulary from section 4.1 of the text, which I didn't assign because I didn't want to assign 3 pages of text just so that you could be introduced to 3 different vocabulary terms. And so rather than doing that, I thought that I would just go over the important vocabulary terms with you at the beginning of this video. So we are on the topic of the free will determinism debate. And that necessitates an understanding of what we mean by determinism. In philosophy, whenever the word determinism is used, it's simply a reference to a theory that maintains that every event has a cause. So to say that something is determined, to say that an action was determined or that a behavior was determined, all we mean to say is that the action or the behavior, excuse me, my phone is vibrating very loudly. All we mean to say is that the action or the behavior in question had a cause. That's it. That's the theory of determinism. Now, let me just go ahead and read this and talk about how this free will determinism debate comes up. So the definition of determinism, the view that every event, including human actions, is brought about. My phone is going nuts here. Sorry about that. The phone that every event, including human actions, is brought about by previous events in accordance with universal causal laws that govern the world. And then this sentence here, human freedom, according to that view, would be an illusion. Now, what is meant by that? What the determinist is going to say is that everything in the universe is governed by physical causal laws. So therefore, anything that happens in that universe is in fact governed by causal law. So the idea there is where we have a causal explanation for a behavior, there's just no room for free will, right? Whenever we talk about the behavior of a cloud, for example, whenever we say, whenever we describe the behavior of a cloud, it rains, right? It precipitates. Well, that's an event. That's a behavior of the cloud. It's something that happened. And notice that we can explain what happened. We can explain the precipitation of the cloud by referring to physical causal law. We don't say that it rained because the cloud wanted to precipitate, right? There's just no room. That's what we mean in saying that there's no room for free will. We already have an explanation for why it rained, right? And we can explain the rain, the precipitation, by referring to physical causal law. The cloud is water vapor, right? And if that water vapor condenses to a certain point, then it becomes heavier than the air that is surrounding it and will fall down, right? That's precipitation. So again, notice that I just explained, I offered an explanation, a causal explanation for an event in the physical world. And how did I explain that event in the physical world? By pointing to physical causal laws. Now, what the determinist is going to say is that, well, you came from the same universe that the cloud did, right? You didn't come from 2 different beginnings, right? It's the same beginning. You're a product of the universe just as the cloud is a product of the universe. So therefore, just as we say the cloud doesn't have free will, we say that the human beings do not have free will. It doesn't make any sense to say that the cloud, precipitated because it wanted to, because it willed itself to be, right? Well, so too we can't say the same thing about humans. It doesn't make any sense to say that humans engage in free will any more than it makes sense to say that rocks and trees and rivers and mountains have free will. Now, there are 2 different versions of determinism. There is a version of determinism called hard determinism, and there's a version of determinism called soft determinism or compatibilism. So hard determinism is determinism, which by definition is saying that human freedom is an illusion, saying that we do not have free will, and because we do not have free will, therefore we cannot be held morally accountable for our actions. So the hard determinist is going to say, well, just as you don't hold a cloud morally accountable for raining, right? So if the proverbial raining on your parade, if that happens, you might get upset. You might not like the fact that it rained on your parade, but you don't hold the cloud morally accountable, right? You don't hold the cloud morally accountable for the action of precipitating because it's a cloud, because it's just a physical thing whose actions are governed by physical causal laws. Now, what the soft determinist or what the compatibilist is going to say, and just to attach some names to this, Baron de Holbach is a hard determinist, right? So he's going to say, precisely because humans lack free will, therefore humans cannot be held morally accountable. The soft determinist or the compatibilist, someone like Daniel Dennett, who sort of mentioned in passing in the confines of your textbook, but we're going to be discussing him, or let me rephrase that. I'm asking you to listen to an audio interview with Daniel Dennett on this topic. So what Daniel Dennett is going to say, well, determinism is true, but just because we acknowledge that everything has a cause doesn't mean that we have to abandon the concept of moral responsibility and moral accountability. We can still hold people morally accountable for their actions, even if we acknowledge that every action, in fact, has a cause. So that's Daniel Dennett. We're going to be looking at him as a representative of the theory of compatibilism. And then there's this other account. There's one here that we're not going to be discussing, William James. But the third voice that we're going to be looking at in this unit on the free will determinism debate is that of Jean-Paul Sartre. And he's an existentialist more generally, but existentialism and libertarianism have the same viewpoint whenever it comes to human action, meaning that what the libertarian is going to say, and whenever we say libertarianism in this context, we're not talking about the political theory, we're talking about the philosophical theory of libertarianism, and the philosophical theory of libertarianism is defined here. The view that humans are able to make authentically free choices that are not determined by previous events in accordance with universal causal laws. That there is a meaningful sense that though we made one choice, we could have done otherwise. And so what somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre is going to say is that everything else in the universe is governed by causal law. The cause and effect chain dictates what's going to be happening to everything else in the universe, but it doesn't dictate what's going to be happening to human beings. And precisely because humans have free will, therefore we have moral accountability. Now that's different from soft determinism, remember, because soft determinism, otherwise referred to as compatibilism, maintains that we do not have free will, but we still have moral accountability. The libertarian version of existentialism, well, let me rephrase that, existentialism, which is a version of libertarianism, maintains that we have free will, and because we have free will, we have moral accountability. So now, with all those points of vocabulary hammered out, let's get to the reading assignment for today. For this video. The reading assignment for this video is pages 199 through 207, and it's titled Determinism, which we've already defined. So I'm just going to scroll through some of those opening paragraphs there and get right to Baron de Holbach. And Baron de Holbach, who's, a little bit of his biography is referenced here. The author of your textbook identifies him as a French philosopher, which isn't quite right. He was a Franco-German philosopher, meaning that he was born in Germany, but he spent his life, and he was culturally French, but he was German by heritage. So again, not quite right there. He wrote in French, but he also wrote in German. So he's not a French philosopher. He's a Franco-German philosopher. A contemporary of David Hume, who we met David Hume at an earlier point in the semester. And so what what Baron de Holbach is doing here in this opening paragraph is he's laying out his hard determinism. So remember what we mean by that term. Determinism, the denial of human freedom. Hard determinism means that because human beings lack free will, therefore we can't be held morally accountable. And in these green highlighted passages here, Baron de Holbach is just sort of laying out his determinist case. He's saying that, human beings are just these physical entities that are born into a physical universe that is governed by physical causal law. And where we have physical causal law, there's no room for free will. And this is what differentiates hard determinism from soft determinism. Because we have no free will, therefore there is no such thing as moral accountability. So what Baron de Holbach does here, I'm just going to read this second green highlighted passage. What Baron de Holbach is doing here is trying to soften up some of our entrenched attitudes and beliefs about human freedom, because human beings like to think of themselves as free. I'm my own person. I'm in charge of my own self, right? And what de Holbach's going to be doing here in this passage is pointing out that, well, we're not nearly as free as we think we are, and perhaps we're not free at all. So he says, we are born without our own consent, which is true, right? You didn't decide to be born. I didn't decide to be born. We just sort of find ourselves existing. We find ourselves living a life that we did not consent to, that we did not ask to come into. He says, and I'm just going to read this in the original language, excuse the sexist language he's writing in the 1700s. He is born without his own consent. His organization does in no wise depend upon himself. His ideas come to him involuntarily. Now, what he means there, again, I already talked about what it means to be born without your consent. His organization does in no wise depend upon himself. You didn't decide to have 2 arms and 2 legs. You didn't decide to have kidneys. You didn't decide what the color of your eyes were going to be, or what your ethnicity was going to be, right? Or what your genitalia was going to be. All of that stuff is just handed to you. You're just born with that configuration. This line here, his ideas come to him involuntarily. Now, what he's mean there is that people like to think, it's like, well, I'm in charge of my own thoughts. And it's like, what de Holbach's pointing out here is, well, no, you're not, very clearly, right? Because I can just ask you to think about polar bears. And now all of a sudden you're thinking about polar bears. And that's not because you wanted to think about polar bears, right? That's because I'm talking about polar bears. And so you have this idea, the idea of a polar bear. Maybe it's the idea of a unicorn. And now all I had to do was mention unicorns. And now all of a sudden you're thinking about unicorns. You're not thinking about unicorns because you wanted to think about unicorns. You're thinking about unicorns because I'm talking about unicorns, right? So that's an idea that you have that came to you involuntarily. His habits are in the power of those who cause him to contract them. So think about the habits that you develop as a result of your childhood. And why did you have certain habits as a result of your childhood? Well, because of the environment in which you grew up. Some people grow up and they had parents that encouraged them to form the habit of making their bed every day. And then some people are born into families who had parents that didn't care whether their bed was made every day or not. And so some people get in the habit of making their bed because of their parents. And some people get in the habit of not making their bed because of their parents and because of their childhood. And what de Holbach's going to point out is, well, none of us choose our parents. None of us choose our childhoods or the conditions under which we are going to be having a childhood. So how can any habit which is formed on the basis of something that I didn't choose be considered a choice, right? That's what de Holbach's going to be emphasizing here. He says, he is unnecessarily modified by causes, whether visible or concealed, over which he has no control, which necessarily regulate his mode of existence, give a hue to his way of thinking, and determine his manner of acting. He is good or bad, happy or miserable, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without his will being for anything in these various states. Nevertheless, in spite of the shackles by which he is bound, notice that very strong language, by the shackles by which he is bound, it is pretended that he is a free agent. So We act as if we are free, but we're not free. All of our actions are governed by those causal forces, none of which we chose. And so if I'm in a condition where I'm making choices on the basis of a life that determined my actions, how can anything that I choose be said to be free? Dolbach's going to conclude that it can't. It doesn't make any sense to say that. And because we're not free, we can't be held morally accountable for our actions. Now, let me just take a brief note here. There's a difference between legal accountability and moral accountability, right? What Dolbach's going to say is, well, go ahead and hold people legally accountable for their actions. We can't have rapists, arsonists, and murderers running around in our society. So we're going to have to, catch them, punish them, lock them away, right? But that's legal accountability. What Dolbach is going to say, hold people legally accountable all you want. You can't hold them morally accountable, because to hold them morally accountable is assuming that they could have done otherwise. And that violates this notion of every event having a cause which is dictated by causal law. Let me scroll down here a few more paragraphs. What Dolbach is going to say is that human beings, again, are just part of a physical universe that is governed by physical law. This very brief yellow highlighted passage here. In all of this, a human being, again, forgive the sexist language there, a human being always acts according to necessary laws from which he has no means of emancipating himself, right? So our actions are determined. And remember, to say that an action is determined just means that it has a cause. And where we have a cause, we have causal law. And where there's causal law, there's just no room for human freedom, for free will. Making this point, Dolbach uses the example of somebody who has, a violent thirst. And the person who has violent thirst, in danger of thirsting to death, is going to want to drink some water. And so he gives us this fanciful example of somebody presenting a violently thirsty person with some water, which of course they want. And why do they want it? Because they don't want to die of thirst. But just as they're about to drink the water, the person says, "Oh, by the way, the water's poisoned." Now, notice, Dolbach says, whether the person doesn't drink the water because it is poisoned, or does drink the water because the person would rather die of poisoning than thirsting to death. Notice that I use the word because in both of those situations. What that means is, if something happened because of something else, that's a cause. And where we have cause, we have causal law. So it doesn't matter what the person does, whether the person drinks the poisoned water or doesn't drink the poisoned water. We have an explanation for why they did it, right? Some people would rather die of thirst than poisoning. Some people would rather die of poisoning than thirst. So that's a basis, that's a preference that somebody might have, but nobody chooses a preference. And this is an important aspect to understanding Dolbach. We act on the basis of our preferences, clearly, but we don't choose the preferences themselves. And because we don't choose our preferences, how can any choice that I make, made on the basis of a preference that I didn't choose, how can that be said to be free? Holbach's going to say it doesn't make any sense, right? Even if we acknowledge that human beings act on the basis of preferences, which clearly we do. That doesn't mean that we are free, because all we're doing is acting in accordance with a preference that itself was unchosen. And how did we come to have that preference? Maybe it was nature, maybe it was nurture, right? But either way, Dolbach's going to say, we have an explanation. Maybe, somebody, likes Dr. Pepper. And so whenever you're standing in front of a vending machine and you have a selection of all those different sodas, somebody's going to choose Dr. Pepper, right? They could have chosen Mountain Dew. They could have chosen Coke. They could have chosen, Lipton iced tea. They could have chosen water. They chose Dr. Pepper. And so what somebody might be, somebody might be tempted to say, well, there you go. There's a free choice. I had all those other options. I chose Dr. Pepper. And what Dolbach's going to say is, well, the choice to drink Dr. Pepper was based on preference. And so now the question becomes, well, why do you prefer the taste of Dr. Pepper over the taste of Coke? Well, who knows, right? Maybe you prefer the maybe you prefer the taste of Dr. Pepper because you had this fond memory of, being on a fishing boat on a hot summer day with your grandfather. And at a certain point, he reaches into a styrofoam cooler and pulls out this ice cold Dr. Pepper and pops it open and shares it with you. And maybe as a result of that fond memory, you have this affinity for Dr. Pepper. You have this preference for Dr. Pepper. Now, of course, that's nurture, right? You're not in control over who your grandparent was. You're not in control over whether your grandpa takes you on a fishing trip whenever you're 8 years old. All that's handed to you. But maybe you prefer Dr. Pepper because of the way the taste buds in your mouth interact with the chemical ingredients, the chemical constituents rather, of Dr. Pepper. Well, there also notice that you don't choose what your taste buds are. You don't choose how your taste buds are going to interact with those ingredients. So whether you prefer Dr. Pepper because of a fond memory that you have with your grandfather, or whether you prefer Dr. Pepper because of your taste buds, well, either way, it's not something that, the preference isn't something that you chose. It's something that was handed to you. And so Dolbach doesn't have any patience for this line of argument at all. He's going to say, no, it's like all of our choices are simply indicative of our preferences, but we don't choose our preferences. So therefore, we don't have free will, and therefore we can't be held accountable, morally accountable, for our actions. So does choice imply freedom? No, I've already covered that. And Dolbach uses an example of Socrates simply to point out the difference between internal versus external constraints. We don't say Socrates is free if he's chained to a wall or locked up in a cell. But what Dolbach points out is, well, just because he's not chained, physically chained, doesn't mean that he doesn't have internal constraints. Constraints are constraints, whether they're internal or external. So that's the point that Dolbach is making there. So you might be tempted to say that Socrates was free to do otherwise simply because he wasn't locked up in a jail cell. And what Dolbach's going to say, no, just because he didn't have chains on him doesn't mean that he was free. He was still, his actions were still determined by all of these other things, seen or unseen. The picture of the person in the river here is this going back to a metaphor that Dolbach himself uses. He says that, well, you're just like a swimmer who is in a river, and you think that your forward motion is because you're swimming. I'm paddling my arms. I'm really doing something here. I'm accomplished something here. And what Dolbach's going to say, well, you're not moving forward because of what you're doing. You're moving forward because of the current of the river, right? So you think you're in charge of your life. Why do you think you're in charge of your life? Because I'm making all these kind of actions and decisions, right? But what Dolbach's going to say is you're just like the helpless swimmer who is moving forward, not because of what he's doing, but because of the current of the river. And there he concludes this this portion of his argument, which we're just looking at one selection from his System of Nature, by sort of pointing out that we think we're free simply because of the amount of complexity involved in identifying what the causes are. But just because we can't point our finger to the specific cause and say this is the why, it doesn't mean that there's not a why, right? There's always a cause for our actions. Sometimes it's seen, sometimes it's unseen. Sometimes the cause is by nature, sometimes the cause is by nurture. But there's always a cause. And where we have a cause, we have causal law. And where there's causal law, there's just no room for free will. So those were my comments about the reading assignment associated with Dolbach. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about the compatibilism of Daniel Dennett. So what Dennett's going to say is that, well, we can still hold on to determinism. We don't want to abandon determinism, because determinism, is pretty, pretty helpful to us in explaining human behavior more generally. But just because we're capable of explaining human behavior doesn't mean that we have to excuse all forms of human behavior. So that's going to be the position of Daniel Dennett, but I will be talking about in the next video. For now, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, and I will see you in the next one.